Everyone has the right to live their life free from violence, fear and abuse. But not everyone can protect themselves from harm and exploitation. Would you recognise the different types of abuse if you saw them? Would you know how to report it and what happens if you do? By the end of this DVD, you will have discussed the types of abuse, who to report it to and the agencies involved to make you more confident about safeguarding. Before we start, let's be really clear about who we might make a safeguarding alert about. We asked Sonia Shipman to find out more about raising an alert and about who a vulnerable adult is.
Well, we do have a clear definition for vulnerable adults, and that includes somebody who's in receipt of or may need community care services and is unable to protect themselves from significant harm or exploitation. So when we're looking at safeguarding of vulnerable adults, we would look at that definition as a starting point.
Is that clear? Let's think about it a bit more. Some adults may be more at risk of abuse than others. The following things may increase the risk of abuse: physical disability, learning disability, sight or hearing loss, mental health problems, severe illness, dementia or confusion. Also, people who depend on others to care for them may not be able to stop someone else from hurting them or taking advantage of them. Let's face it, that could be any of us during our lifetime. So we know who might be considered a vulnerable adult. But what is abuse? There are 7 different types of abuse that should lead to a safeguarding alert being raised. Let's look at them.
I can't do things anymore.
I won't be back for 2 days. You'll be all right, won't you? You'll be all right, won't you?
This is no life. Please let me die.
That's one example of neglect. Can you think of any others? Let's move on to financial abuse.
I work hard. I deserve a little treat. He won't notice. I don't get paid enough. I need a few bonuses.
She never gives me my change.
I found that quite surprising. Can you think of anything else that might be considered financial abuse? Discrimination is something that can affect us all, but can you imagine living with it every day?
You Klingon.
Weirdo.
You waste of space.
He's a freak.
You spacker. You moron.
I don't know about you, but I find that quite upsetting. Can you think of anything else that might be considered discriminatory abuse? Of course, some types of abuse can be easier to recognise than others. What would you do? We need to remember that a vulnerable adult is someone that cannot protect themselves from harm and might not be able to or want to tell someone what is happening. Sonia spoke to DI John Trott, who explained why it is so important that if you see something, say something.
It's really important then that if people see something, they say something, John, isn't it?
It is vitally important, and the reason being is that the bit of information they have may just be the bit of information that we need to complete the jigsaw puzzle, which will allow us to then safeguard an individual. So people sometimes, unfortunately, are afraid to report it because they think, well, that may just have been a one-off. My answer to them would be, it may be, but it might not be. It could actually be the tip of the iceberg. And if you don't report it, then potentially that person, worst case scenario, could be dead. So if you see something and you're not happy about it, report it to the various authorities, and they've got enough professionals there to make sure that things are looked at properly, appropriately and tactfully. If there is anything there, that person will be properly safeguarded and protected. If there isn't, then fine. So it is really, really important for people to report things.
That's a really vital point. You may have seen or heard something that you might not think is important, but put together with all the other information, it may be life-changing. Let's look at the other types of abuse. Sexual abuse can and does happen to adults. Can you think of any possible scenarios?
It's our little secret.
It seems not a day goes by when the news doesn't report on institutional abuse. Would you recognise it? Sonia asked Adrian Bartram to tell us a bit more about this.
Talked a bit about vulnerable people who've been abused maybe by carers, but I've heard recently that it also happens in places where there are professional carers, like hospitals and residential homes.
I think because we've identified now that individuals have such a right to a quality of life and to be at the centre of all their care, that once you move away from being client focused, it's very easy to identify lower levels of abuse and sometimes higher levels. So very much in very busy settings that sometimes more task focused, it can be very easily moved away from being client focused, and clients can be left feeling vulnerable, neglected and not having their needs met the way they would want their needs to be met, which would constitute abuse.
Can you think of some examples? So let's look at the last type of abuse. You may not be able to see the physical signs of psychological abuse, but it still leaves deep emotional wounds. Can you think of any examples of this? So we've looked at neglect, discrimination, sexual, psychological, physical, financial and institutional abuse. But what would we need to do to report it? The first step is to call the access team. But before you call, try to have all the information ready. Sonia asked Sandy from the access team to explain the process and why it is so important that if you see something, say something.
And I just wondered what happened if somebody's got concerns and they make that call to you.
The person that has got concerns for a vulnerable adult would be treated by the access team in the first instance. We would take all their concerns and we would then record all of their concerns, and it would then go through to the safeguarding triage team, who would then look at that and make a decision, and if necessary they would then hold a strategy meeting to stop that abuse from happening.
I expect some people might be a bit reluctant to contact you with a concern because they're not sure that it is actually abuse or neglect because they haven't got any evidence.
That's fine. I mean, any concern, we would say please report it immediately, because you may only have a tiny little piece of evidence, but by us making further inquiries, investigations with other people, professionals, it will give us a bigger picture and we can then look at the whole picture like a jigsaw puzzle.
I hope you found this training useful. We all have a responsibility to safeguard vulnerable adults.
Say something.
Say something.